All right, let's get right into it. If you've been tuning into the financial news lately, honestly, you'd think we're living in some sort of golden age, right? I mean, the stock market is just shattering records left and right, home prices are absolutely soaring, and overall national net worth literally never been higher. But step away from Wall Street, go talk to your neighbor, and man, you hear a totally different story. Today we're doing an explainer on this massive, glaring disconnect between those super upbeat financial headlines and the actual everyday reality for millions of us.
So it's kind of the ultimate question, isn't it? If the American economy is supposedly booming on paper, why does it feel so bad for so many people? It's a question driving a ton of economic anxiety right now. And frankly, if you've been feeling that squeeze yourself, you are absolutely not alone. Today, we're going to break down the core paradox of our modern financial system. We're looking under the hood of these booming numbers, and by the end of this explainer, you'll see exactly why the old-school ways we measure a good economy are completely missing the bigger picture.
Okay, let's dive into this. Part 1, the Great Economic Paradox.
Let's start by looking at this glaring contradiction right at the center of the data. On one hand, you've got the economy on paper. The stock market literally just hit its 23rd record high in a single year. Home prices, net worth, all at historic peaks. But right next to that, we have the economy in reality. Consumer sentiment, how everyday people actually feel about the economy, has fallen to its lowest level ever recorded. Just let that sink in for a second. People feel worse about the economy right now than they did during the 1980s recession, worse than the 2008 financial crash, and yep, even worse than during the pandemic lockdowns. So how on earth can both of these things be true at the exact same time?
Well, to understand this, let's look at one of the most standard retirement vehicles out there, the 401k. The average 401k balance recently hit a record high of over $160,000. Now, on the surface, you see that number and think, boom, things are great. It looks like absolute proof that the system is working and wealth is growing. But this single impressive-looking number is actually hiding a much darker secret about what's really happening on the ground level.
Because while those balances hit record highs, a record number of people were simultaneously cashing them out early. They're willingly paying those steep, painful penalties just to get desperate access to their own money. Roughly 6% of savers raided their retirement accounts recently. That's 3 times the rate we saw before the pandemic. And just look at why they're doing it. 36% pulled money out just to avoid foreclosure or eviction. 31% did it to cover medical expenses. 13% for tuition. It's wild. It proves we're essentially living in 2 completely different Americas right now. One America is sitting back watching their accounts compound, while the other is literally draining their future just to survive the present.
Which brings us to part 2. Who actually owns the market? When we constantly hear that the economy is booming, we really need to stop and ask, whose accounts are these gains actually flowing into? Who owns the market? The Federal Reserve's own data paints a pretty startling picture here. The wealth generated by a booming stock market, it doesn't fall on the whole country like rain. It lands in very, very specific buckets. The top 10% of wealthiest households, that's about 13 million households, they own roughly 87% of all the stocks in the country. That leaves the bottom 90%, nearly 120 million households, left fighting over just 13% of the market.
And as you go further down, the reality gets even starker. Check out this fact. The bottom half of Americans, we're talking the teachers, the nurses, the bus drivers, the folks who actually keep the day-to-day of this country running, those 67 million households own just 1% of the total stock market. And to be clear, that's not 1% each, that is 1% total, split amongst all of them. So for half the country, market record highs aren't creating wealth at all. They're literally just a headline you scroll past on your way to clock in at a 9-to-5 job.
And this brilliantly illustrates what that gap looks like in actual real-world dollars. Sure, technically over half of Americans own some stock, usually tucked away in a 401k. But owning some stock and owning enough for it to actually change your life are 2 very different things. For the bottom 50%, median holdings are about $13,000. So say we get a 16% market gain. That gives them a paper gain of about $2,000. Not bad, right? But for the top 10%, whose median holdings are $600,000, that exact same 16% market gain hands them over $96,000 in a single year. That's a massive 48-fold gap. The actual dollars were never democratized, only the participation was.
All right, moving on to part 3. The rise of survival debt.
So, if the bottom half of the country isn't making money from this booming asset market, how are they handling their day-to-day expenses? Let's shift our focus away from the asset owners and zoom down to the ground level, to the actual wallets of everyday Americans. We're constantly told that consumer spending is strong, so hey, things must be fine.
But let's look at the money actually coming in. Recently, average hourly earnings were up about 3.6%. Sounds like a solid raise. But over that exact same stretch, inflation was up 3.8%. And total prices, they are up over 28% since the start of 2020. What this means is that before a single dollar is even spent, the average consumer's raise is already entirely eaten up by inflation. They're losing ground before they even walk through the grocery store doors.
Now, if your wages aren't keeping up with a 28% jump in prices, but you still, have to eat and pay rent, where does that money come from? It comes from the future. It comes from debt. Americans are currently carrying around $1.25 trillion in credit card debt and an average interest rate of 23%. And here's the kicker. A full third of those people are using it just to finance their day-to-day expenses. They aren't chasing airline miles here. This is what experts are now calling survival debt. It's borrowing money at 23% interest literally just to keep the lights on. Mike Croxon, who runs the largest nonprofit credit counseling network in the U.S., perfectly captures how severe this crisis really is. He notes this disturbing shift from discretionary debt, like buying a new TV or booking a vacation, to survival debt. And the truly terrifying thing about survival debt is that there's usually no easy way out. 61% of people have now been trapped carrying this credit card debt for over a year. They're just treading water.
And guys, the safety net isn't just straining right now, it is actively breaking. Over 90 million Americans are now using buy now, pay later apps. These used to be for things like concert tickets or maybe a new couch. Now, over a quarter of users rely on them to buy their groceries. Just think about how desperate that situation is. When a massive chunk of the country is splitting a burrito or their weekly grocery run into 4 biweekly installments. Meanwhile, the overall personal savings rate, the exact thing that's supposed to catch a family when, say, the car breaks down, has plummeted to 2.6%. That is near the lowest level we have on record.
But remember, that 2.6% is just an average. When economists broke that number down by income, they found a stark, undeniable reality. The personal savings rate for the bottom half of the country is completely negative. More than 65 million households are currently spending more than they bring in after taxes. They're running a loss every single month. They aren't building a safety net at all. They are actively sinking deeper. Let's move to part 4 and see how this all builds into the new E-shaped economy.
Because clearly, the old models just aren't working to explain this divide anymore. For years, economists talked about the K-shaped economy. You know the idea. Winners on the top arm going up, losers on the bottom arm going down. The classic rich get richer, poor get poorer scenario. But honestly, that simple K-shape doesn't accurately describe the true structural divide in the U.S. economy anymore. We need a much more honest visualization of America's current class divide.
The more accurate shape of the American economy right now is actually an E. Picture a normal capital letter E with its 3 horizontal bars. Now take that top bar and stretch it way, way out, far past the others. Leave the bottom bar low, right down near the floor. And then take that middle bar and tilt it so it slopes downward. This right here is the E-shaped economy. It represents 3 distinct classes living 3 completely different lives, all inside the exact same country.
Let's start with that top bar, the ownership class. This is the richest 10%. Their wealth doesn't come from an hourly wage. It lives in assets, things like stocks and real estate. Since 2020, home prices are up 55%, and the stock market is up over 120%. This top bar has stretched so unbelievably far out because they watched their net worth absolutely explode, simply because they hold the assets that are rapidly inflating. They are experiencing the historic boom firsthand.
Then we have the bottom bar, the one left down near the floor. This represents the 67 million households that own almost none of those booming assets. This is the group that's trapped with negative savings, drowning in that survival debt we talked about, and using apps to finance their weekly groceries. They aren't riding any wave of asset inflation. They are just desperately trying not to drown in the rising cost of living.
And then there's the middle bar, representing the middle class. So why is it sloping downward? Heather Long, the chief economist at Navy Federal Credit Union, explains this beautifully. She notes a pronounced shift in consumer data. People are actively migrating away from premium experiences and shifting their spending toward warehouse and discount stores, places like Aldi and Walmart. This middle bar represents the folks whose wages just got completely devoured by inflation. Their financial breathing room is getting thinner and thinner by the day, and financially, they are quietly slipping downward.
So, the crucial point here is summarized perfectly by how wealth and income are actually distributed across this E-shape. Get this. The top 10% hold a massive 68% of the net worth and earn over half the income in the country.
The middle 40% hold about 29% of the wealth, and the bottom 50% of the entire country, they are left to split just 2.5% of the total net worth and 10% of the income. This ever-widening wealth gap is the exact reason why the booming financial news on your TV and the reality inside your bank account simply do not match.
When you pull all this data together, the grand paradox finally makes sense. Add up all the gains in the market. And sure, the charts will tell you the economy is booming, but those charts don't tell you who is actually holding that wealth. We are living in the exact same country, but we are experiencing completely different Americas. We've built an E-shaped economy, and the reality of your day-to-day life depends entirely on where you sit within it, which leaves us with one final, deeply personal question to think about. Which bar are you on? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I'll catch you next time.